I'm right there with you, buddy. Oh. Please pray with me. Dear God, help once more unto the bridge. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We are all different, and a very good thing. 4 years, 10 weddings, 23 baptisms, 38 funerals, and something like 196 sermons. It's been a thing. We are all different, and that's a very good thing. I started my first sermon in this church with those words. Now, at the time, what I had meant was that we are all different, that we have different preferences, likes and dislikes, gifts, styles, and ways. I meant it to say that God created us with diversity. But today, I'm standing in front of you, and I mean something very different. I am a different man than I was 4 years ago. We are all different. And that's a very good thing, because in this place, in the presence of God, we grow. I don't know how many of you know this, but I try really hard to drench my sermon writing process in prayer. I've never felt more insufficient than when I start a sermon. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sitting there. And so I always start the same way. I start by praying, and I ask God for help. But I'm sure many of you know by now, fire is one of my absolute favorite visuals or pieces of imagery for the presence of God. And so what I do every time I write a sermon is I say ask God to come and help me write. And then I have 2 candles in my office sitting on my desk, and I light them. And this past week, I sat down to write this sermon, and I have a little box of matches. I use real matches because maybe I just like to play with fire. And I'm sitting there, and I've got my box of matches, and I strike the match, and it broke. I don't know why, but for some reason, I felt like I didn't want to throw it away. I had this little stub of a match, and I decided not to throw it away and get a new one. I took that little stub of a match, and I struck it again. And I lit both my candles before my finger. And I know I was supposed to be writing the sermon, but all I could think about was whether this was a metaphor for the way that we come to God. Broken, failed, smaller than we're supposed to be. And so we begin. Today I chose the last chapter in the book of Galatians, and I went with the whole chapter. These are Paul's final words to the church in Galatia. You see, in this church at that time, they had a lot of confusion in the early church, mostly about the issue of circumcision. They had some false teachers that came in, and they were very confused. And so this chapter is how Paul chose to end his letter to his church. And it starts in verse 1. Dear brothers and sisters, if another believer is overcome by some sin, you who are godly should gently and humbly help that person back onto the right path, and be careful not to fall into the same temptation yourself. This thing that we do in this place, you see, there's a reason that we can't do religion alone. There's a reason that we have to get out of bed, get off of the couch, and get ourselves to church. Because we need one another. It says, if one of your brothers and sisters in this church is overcome by some sin, we have to gently and humbly help them back onto the right path. This is what we call accountability. But I want to point something out. Look very closely at what it says. How do we help people get back onto the right path? Gently and humbly. Right? Will you say that with me? Gently and humbly. Thank you. Being careful not to fall. There are times when we have to stand up to one another. And that can be the hardest thing to do. We have to speak the truth in love. And it's the hardest thing for a friend to do. And so gently and humbly we help one another, being careful not to fall into the sin ourselves. We start to help, when we start to help others, we have to guard our heart. Verse 2 continues, and he says, share each other's burdens, and in this way obey the law of Christ. If you think you are too important to help someone, you are only fooling yourself. You are not that important. I love reading Paul. He is so arrogant and just a little bit sassy. If you think you are too important to help someone, you are only fooling yourself. You are not that important. Of course, his point is that we are never too good to help one another. It says share in each other's burdens. And I have seen that happen in this place. Do you guys remember the baby Grayson benefit? A couple of years ago. He's 2 now and walking and has a little sister. Do you remember the pancake breakfast back in January for Anthony Peterson? We have shared, and it doesn't have to be big fundraisers, big massive events. Do you remember all those mile stories? All the little things that we have done over the years to put things into our community? The time, or just simply the times when people have shared their loss. In this place, people have gone through divorce. People have gone through death and loss in their family. People have had medical scares. They have grieved, and we have grieved with them. We have shared one another's burdens. Never lose that, Wesley. You are never too important to help one another. It says in verse 4, it says, pay careful attention to your own work, for then you will get satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to anyone else, for we are each responsible for our own conduct. Now, I want to point something out here. If we look closely, the fact that this verse comes right after the one about bearing burdens and gently and humbly loving a brother and sister who falls into sin, that tells us something very important. Because if you read just verse 4 and 5 all by itself, it kind of sounds like, focus on your business, don't compare, mind your own business. Right? That's kind of what that verse sounds like. But when you take it all together, what it's saying is that there is no competition in love. There's no competition in when we help each other. It is not better people helping worse people. We are responsible for our own conduct no matter what other people around us do. There's an old story I saw on TV years ago, and it says a man falls into a pit. A man falls into a pit, and a doctor walks by. And the man cries out to the doctor for help, and the doctor writes him a prescription, throws it in the hole. And then a priest walks by, and the man cries out for help, and the priest writes him a prayer and throws it in the hole. And then a politician walks by, and again the man cries out desperately for help, and the politician writes him a law, throws it in the hole. A friend walks by, and the man is tired at this point, and he cries out for help, and the friend jumps into the pit. And the man looks at his friend and says, "You idiot! Now we're both stuck in the pit." And the friend looks at him and says, "Oh, see, I've been down here before, and I know the way out." It's not a competition. It's not better people helping worse people. It's a friend down in the pit with you. You are responsible for your conduct no matter what the world. So guard your heart and be careful not to fall into the same problems. But when you can, gently and humbly help someone back onto the right path. It's one of the reasons we do what we do. Verse 7, we shift to Paul's second major point. He says in verse 7, "Do not be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit." So let's not get tired of doing what is good, because at just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. If we don't give up. Paul's second point, it's no great secret. You will harvest what you plant. That was our focus last year. Do you guys remember the vision statement? Today's footprint is tomorrow's legacy. The things we did, the things are the way they are today because of what we did yesterday. And things will be better or worse tomorrow depending on what we do today. So, in the spirit of planting and harvesting, in collaboration with Pastor Matt, I have some goals for Wesley Church. Now, I had this idea a couple of months ago, and one of the last things I wanted to do was lay down some goals for the future of Wesley Church. But then I thought, that's probably not very appropriate. That's not really my place. It's not my job to lay out the future of Wesley Church. So I called Pastor Matt, and I chatted with him, and I said, what do you think? What should we do? And together we came up with 4 goals for the future of Wesley Church. You ready? Number 1. Last year, we paid off a massive mortgage on this church. We are a debt-free church. We paid it off 10 years ahead of schedule. And so it is time for us to become, we got to pay 100% of our apportionments. It's time for us to pay 100% of our apportionments. It's long overdue. But to go even further, it is time for Wesley to become a spotlight church once again. Now, for those who don't know what that is, spotlight churches are exceptional churches in our conference, in our district, that meet certain requirements as far as giving and other criteria. So that's number 1. It is time for us to become a spotlight church. Number 2, we want attendance goals. We want to see a youth group that matches 20% of the worshiping congregation. So that would take it to about 20, 30 kids. We want to see the same thing for Messy Church. We're averaging 20 for the last year. We want to see 30 next year. And then we want to see a life group program that matches 50% of the worshiping congregation. We want to see 75 people involved in life groups. Average attendance right now is 150. We want to see 160 in the next year. It's a reasonable goal. So number 1, Spotlight Church. Number 2, attendance. Now, number 3, one of Pastor Matt's focuses was community, community, community. He believes, and I agree, that it is time for Wesley to get very intentional about getting out into our community to make our town a better place. And so this fall, we want to establish a visibility team with a focus on outreach, community care, and witnessing. Now, he also mentioned growth in the men's ministry because that's been part of his ministry in the past. And here's the big one. So, Spotlight Church, attendance goals. What was the third one? Community visibility team. And the fourth one, it is time for Wesley Church to start the conversation about a third service. Now, that can mean a lot of things. Maybe we're looking at Saturday night. Maybe Sunday night. Maybe we need to have something in the middle of the week for people who work on the weekends, right? Maybe Tuesday night, Wednesday night. Maybe we need to have it off campus. Maybe we should meet in a bar or somewhere else off campus. Maybe we should look at multi-siting, having church in multiple locations. I'm serious. This is things that are happening. Maybe we need to do something cooperative with the Nagani Church. It is time for Wesley to begin the conversation, starting a third service to reach people we're not already reaching. You will always harvest what you plant, and if you plant nothing, you will harvest nothing. And so he ends that section in verse 5. He says, therefore, whenever we have the opportunity, we should do good to everyone, especially to those in the family of faith. Now, verse 11, we get to the final section of our scripture for today. Verse 11 starts with Paul's final advice. He says, notice what large letters I use as I write these closing words in my own handwriting. Now, my Bible is typed, and so they just put it all in caps lock. They just kind of put it all in big letters. But I would have loved to see the original document. Just Paul just writing in big letters all over the paper. This is really important. Verse 15. It doesn't matter whether we have been circumcised or not. Remember, that was the big controversy of his church. It doesn't matter if we've been circumcised or not. What counts is whether we have been transformed into a new creation. First, Paul talks about how we treat one another, about how we help each other. Then Paul goes into talking about how we harvest what we plant. And so we set our goals, and we plan to have a good harvest. But the last thing Paul has to say is about what we do in the midst of controversies. Verse 15 is the key, and it goes way beyond this little conversation about circumcision. Paul basically is saying it doesn't matter about insert major controversy that everybody arguing about. It doesn't matter about that. What matters is whether you are a new creation in God, transformed into a new creation. Now, I want to here. I'm not saying the controversy is not important. I'm not saying, Paul picked a side. There was a right or a wrong answer. That's true. But he didn't want the controversy to be the focus. He wanted the focus to be crystal clear. You are a new creation in God. You see, the good news this morning is that God transforms us. We are all different, and that's a very good thing. Everything I have ever taught you, every story we have ever shared, every ridiculous joke we have ever laughed at. Do you remember when I said boobs in church? You thought I wouldn't ever say it again. Everything we talk about here, everything comes down to one question. Are you closer to God today than you were yesterday? Are you closer to Jesus today than yesterday? At some point in every single one of our lives, we have made mistakes. We screwed up. We call that sin. We have hurt the heart of God. We have rebelled and lived in a way that is not what God taught us. We hurt people. We hurt each other. We start broken, far away from God. But the story of Jesus is that God came down to us, that God came down to this earth, from heaven to earth. He came for the sinners, for the lost and the broken. He came for me. He comes for you. That's the message here. And he offers us forgiveness. He offers us a second chance, a chance to wipe away all the darkness that's living in our hearts. And then he shows us a better way to live. This is what I'm talking about when I say new creation. God transforms us in 1,000 ways each and every day. God is molding us and making us in big, huge ways over the years. God is creating us into who we are. He's always working on us. God never gives up on us. When we drift away from God and we find ourselves broken all over again, God is still there waiting for us to come home. And so if you have drifted away from God, let me beg you one more time with my last opportunity. Let me beg you, come home. Come home to Jesus, because he's waiting for you. He's waiting with open arms. God transforms his people. We are different than we used to be. And that's a very good thing. Paul wraps it up in verse 16. He says, may God's peace and mercy be on all who live by this principle. They are the new people of God. And so I have one final challenge for the people of Wesley Church. Live by this principle. You are the new people of God. You are different than when you were controlled by the things in the world. You are Jesus's. He has bought you. He owns you. He loves you. We are Jesus's. And when we're going to live for Jesus, you are the new people of God. And if you look back over the whole chapter, there's 3 parts to it. First, he says, bear one another's burdens. Pay careful attention to your own work. Work hard on your business, but when it is necessary, gently and humbly help a brother or sister back into the right path. Be careful not to fall in yourself. You remember what it was like in the pit. Gently and humbly help them back onto the right path. Bear one another's burdens. Number 2, plant good things so that you can harvest good things. Set goals and then take steps to get it done. Bear one another's burdens, plant your seeds, and finally, never forget that you are a new creation. You are different than when you were in the world. It doesn't matter what controversies come. It doesn't matter what mountains or valleys come up in your life. It doesn't matter the mistakes you made yesterday. God is still with you. God is with us every step of the way. God transforms you into a new creation. A broken match can still light a fire. In fact, it seems to be God's favorite way to get the flames going. And so, Wesley, I'll leave you with this. May you remember that we are all different, and that's a very good thing. May you remember that we have come a long ways, but we are not done yet. May you remember that today's footprint is tomorrow's legacy. And Wesley, start a fire. Amen.